Today we're going to tackle the topic of critical thinking in philosophy. And it's a little bit hard to think about these terms because we don't normally think like philosophers. When philosophers engage with questions that are open-ended questions, they take a four-step approach. The first step is clarifying concepts. Beyond just getting a definition for the terms, it's important to clarify concepts in a more complete or thorough fashion. To do that, we deal with something called necessary conditions and sufficient conditions. By definition, a relationship under a necessary condition is defined as follows. A condition Q, which represents a variable, is necessary for P if it is impossible for something to be P without being Q. Let me give you an example. A condition of animal is a necessary condition for being a horse if it is impossible for something to be a horse and not be an animal. This is important because we need to understand when something is related to something else necessarily, when it has to be a necessary connection. Not all relationships are necessary relationships. That leads us to sufficient condition. A sufficient condition is a condition or a relationship in which a condition Q is sufficient for P if it is impossible for something to be Q and not be P. Let me fill in an example for you. A condition of horse is sufficient for being an animal if it is impossible for something to be a horse and not an animal. Now, why do we call that a sufficient condition? Because a cow is also sufficient condition for being an animal because it is impossible for something to be a cow and not be an animal. Distinguishing between necessary and sufficient conditions takes a lot of practice. But once you get it, it's an extremely useful tool in doing philosophy, in answering hard questions, and in clarifying concepts. The next step is hypothesizing, coming up with hypotheses that are possible answers to the question at hand. Now, philosophers are very good at finding faulty hypotheses and dismissing them. In doing so, we ask ourselves, what is possible? There's two realms of possibility that we deal with. First, there's something called causally possible. Something is causally possible if it does not violate the laws of nature. It may be something highly unlikely or improbable, but there's no violation of the laws of nature. It's like you might throw a dice and get a 6 500 times in a row. Is that causally possible? Yes. It doesn't violate any laws of nature. Very unlikely, but it is possible. Now, what is something that is causally impossible? Something that violates the laws of nature. If I tell you, is it possible for the sun to rotate around the earth? That is causally impossible because it violates the laws of nature. There's another type of possibility, though. And philosophers talk about something being logically possible. The thing about logical possibility is that it could be very highly unlikely and still be logically possible. It could have a violation of a law of nature, but still be logically possible. As long as it does not entail a contradiction, it is logically possible. So the same scenario of the sun revolving around the earth. Well, is it logically possible that a sun can revolve around the earth? Yes, it is logically possible because it doesn't involve any contradiction. Can you imagine a world in which a star like the sun revolves around a planet like an earth? Yes, you can imagine that. No contradictions involved. So that is something that is logically possible, even if it's not actual in our world. It does not entail a contradiction. What is something that is logically impossible? Something that entails a contradiction. To say that a turtle is the creator of the universe is logically impossible. Why? Because it entails a contradiction. A turtle is part of the universe. So if it is already part of the universe, it cannot be the cause of the universe. That's an internal contradiction. So once we've determined what's possible and what's not possible, we should have a list of hypotheses to consider. And then we need to test it. How do we test these hypotheses? There's two things we do. We do thought experiments and we look for counter examples. Thought experiments are those experiments where we think, well, can you imagine a world in which A, B, and C is the case? Or can you imagine a world in which A, B, and C is not the case? If you can either confirm or you can dismiss a hypothesis as being contradictory or impossible. We also rely on counterexamples. Someone may say, well, if you stop believing that there is a hell, then people would stop going to church. If people stopped being afraid of hell, they would stop going to church. Okay, how do we evaluate that thesis? Well, how about a counterexample? I am someone who's not afraid of hell, and I go to church. So I constitute a counterexample that shows that that hypothesis doesn't work. And counterexamples are possible to come up with, and they are powerful in dismissing hypotheses. The idea is to reduce the list of possible answers to the bare minimum, dismissing every possible answer that has internal contradictions or just proves not to be a possibility at all. Then comes the really hard part, judging the possible responses. And that is where the majority of the controversies flare up and resolve. How do we know of the possible answers left which one is true? That's very difficult to do, but it's part of what we do when we engage with these ideas and engage in critical thinking as a philosopher would. I'm Dr. Juan Valdez with Academy of Hope, and that wraps up critical thinking and philosophy.